Hi! This video is about book genres, why authors need them and what readers expect from each.
And at the end, I'm going to share the name of a genre that I bet you have never heard of.
We dressed up for the occasion!
Yes, we thought since we were talking about genres that we would wear some of our fantasy garb.
So, why is it important that authors know about genre?
Well, it really all comes down to marketing, because and that means it's got to do with publishers as well. If you want to get a mainstream publisher, any selective publisher, you need to know what your genre is. And if you're self-publishing, you need to be able to say that to the readers. This is fantasy, or this is a thriller, or this is whatever, because then the reader knows exactly what kind of book it is. And that's your first entrance for sale.
So does that mean you have to write in one particular genre?
No, it doesn't. The knowledge of genres shouldn't be a restriction on your writing. And you can have cross-genre and multi-genre writing, and if it doesn't fit into any of those particular genres, then it probably fits into either contemporary fiction or historical fiction, or maybe it could be literary fiction.
So what are the main book genres?
Fiction, non-fiction. Fiction is, of course, made up.
Yeah.
Right? Non-fiction should be fact or real or true stories. Yeah.
Biographies, memoirs, cookbooks.
Yeah. Things should be well researched, and they should have references at the end and all of that kind of thing. There's also a lot of opinion in the non-fiction category, and you just have to, as a reader, you just have to be careful to know whether you're actually reading opinion or fact. And fiction, again, there's two main categories: genre fiction, literary fiction. Mm-hmm. Genre fiction, or that's sometimes called commercial fiction.
Literary fiction seems to be just anything that doesn't fit in a genre, right?
Yes. But it's more than that. That doesn't make it literary fiction. It has to be deep and meaningful. It has to be moving. And it has to be beautifully written. Mm. So it's a good idea not to label your own book literary fiction, because it might not sort of make the category of...
to leave it to the professionals.
Yeah, because it has to be like really good. And it doesn't mean it's not commercial.
Can it still have a genre though? Like, I mean, you
can... it's probably got multiple genres in it.
Like,
I mean, to be
Jane Austen wrote literary fiction, but it was romance, right?
Yeah. In that day, I think they didn't really think it was...
They didn't call it literary, but now we do.
They thought it was cheap women's fiction. True. So we look back at it.
That was like the Mills and Boon of
the time, yeah.
So back to my original question that I thought was going to be the big one, but I'll be more specific. What are the main categories of genre fiction?
Right. Yes, well, there's thrillers and mysteries, which you usually put together. There's speculative fiction. Do you know what that is?
No.
Aha. Speculative fiction is the overall name for fantasy and sci-fi.
Ah.
They're put together because it's all speculation.
It's an umbrella category.
Yeah. And then there's contemporary fiction, historical fiction, romance, and juvenile fiction, which is children's books and young adult. Mm-hmm. And then there's horror, which can be in sort of any of those things. Yeah. And then there's things like metaphysical and visionary fiction, which also could apply to any of those main genres. You know what metaphysical fiction is?
I mean, I do, but I don't know if most of our viewers do.
Metaphysical is when a book deals with, metaphysics, deals with things beyond the normal, like maybe a little bit spiritual, supernatural, that kind of thing. And visionary fiction is similar, but it's usually with visionary fiction, it's the story of somebody's awakening. So that's what separates visionary fiction from metaphysical.
Spiritual?
Yeah, it's definitely spiritual. I say magical realism. There's another one. Do you know what magical realism is?
It's basically like you're in the real world, but then there is some unexplainable phenomenon in that world. So it's not necessarily magic, but it's like...
It's real.
Something weird just happens.
This is an extended metaphor.
You can't quite tell if it's real or in someone's imagination. There's just always this delightful sort of blurring of the line between
fantasy and reality,
magical world and the reality, because it's often like understated and a little bit like, is that real or is that
Yeah,
Just
and
odd.
I really like that.
Yeah.
Blurring of
Realism too.
fantasy and reality. Okay,
Coming of age is another one that kind of just goes really well into fantasy and
a lot of
young
fantasy,
adult.
and that refers to any story where somebody is really growing up.
Okay, well that wasn't as big a list as I thought. But apparently Amazon has over 16,000 subgenres.
Yeah.
So, I mean, if I was trying to categorize my book, I feel like I would get a little overwhelmed with that many sub-boxes.
I think that includes...
Inside the big boxes.
I think that includes non-fiction as well.
Okay, so
And-
that
but I have...
only halves that.
Yeah, some people... I have heard people say that there's 50 genres, and other people say 75.
Right.
So, you know, there's a lot.
In terms of being specific and sort of niching down your book in terms of getting it to sell, the more specific you can be with the genre, the better it's going to do within that Amazon category. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I'm learning things, folks.
Subgenres, for instance, mysteries. In mysteries, you can have cozy mysteries, right? Which are not violent, not gruesome. They often have female protagonists. They're often set in small towns. They're easy reading.
Like Midsummer Murders or Miss Marple.
Yeah, that kind of thing. And you're not going to stay up at night with them. But at the same time, you know, they are definitely a mystery. You've got hard-boiled
Eggs.
hard-boiled mysteries, which is usually crime. And that's
Gritty.
that's hard-boiled, just like what it sounds. Really straight crime detective stuff, crime noir, and that's when the protagonist is flawed.
Oh yeah, classic noir theme.
Yeah, classic noir theme, and you can't trust their perceptions at all. So we mentioned crime as a subgenre. Detective. There's female detectives is another subcategory, and then there's the gay community.
The LGBTQI.
Yeah.
Boomer.
Those are subcategories of all the categories.
Yeah.
Right, so you can have...
Obviously this list is not... We're not going to list over 16,000 genres for you.
And like in thrillers, there's suspense and there's psychological thrillers. Deals with the psychology of the characters. So a lot of... And psychological suspense is a real thing because a lot of the suspense is in the character's mind and, you know, plays on their fears and stuff.
You can have a whole book with just a woman alone in a house.
And often they are. Yeah. And romantic suspense is a thing. Yeah, and where the woman's not sure if she's safe or not. You know.
Science fiction.
Do you know any subcategories of science fiction?
Yes, there's some written on this piece of paper. We've got military, near future, romance, and first contact.
And there is, of course, also space opera.
Opera. As in soap opera?
Yeah, it tends to be sort of episodal, you know, so you would have a series of books usually, and they're usually about a bunch of quirky characters in a spaceship flying around in space and having various different adventures. So that's sort of, there's usually this humorous aspect to space opera. And of course, military science fiction it's usually written by...
An ex-military person?
Yes.
Fair
And
enough.
when you read it, you can see that military background because, you know, they're using all the military terminology and the way that they will storm a building and all of this. It's, you know, a lot of it's...
tactics.
It's like guerrilla warfare. So there's very much a fighting aspect to that. Near future science fiction is... in the near future.
Like mostly our world, but with a few elements changed.
Yeah, just something that could happen in the next few years. And then there's first contact, which is aliens, and usually aliens coming to Earth, and somebody meeting this alien for the first time and the effects that alien's arrival has on Earth. So those are the main subcategories of science fiction, but you know, then you get a lot of things that sort of can mix in with that, like romance.
So I would have thought that post-apocalyptic and dystopian, like when I think of sci-fi, that's what I immediately think of as post-apocalyptic or dystopian.
Yeah.
Is that not sci-fi?
Yes. It depends on where the dystopian world is set, because a dystopian world is not necessarily in the future, or it's even not necessarily on our world.
Also, sometimes they involve magic, so I guess at that point you're crossing into fantasy. So I guess they're the sort of crossover genres between fantasy and sci-fi.
Yes, and what marks dystopian is the society that people live in, a society that's very controlled and the people are manipulated, and it's all very rigid, and that's the thing. And of course, post-apocalyptic and apocalyptic is disaster stories, which are usually in our world and usually futuristic in our world, and they could be near future. Subgenres of fantasy.
Ooh! Well, there's high fantasy or epic fantasy.
Yep.
There's urban fantasy, which is where it's set more in like an urban setting, and then there's a fantasy element to it.
And it's usually our world, urban.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so high fantasy is like medieval times, a completely other world with high magic and swords and magic and stuff. That's what you've written there as sword and sorcery, is that correct?
Yes, sword and sorcery is anything that's got a lot of swords and sorcery in it. High fantasy is really just describes an incredibly detailed, completely fantasy world. Epic fantasy is very broad in scope, like Lord of the Rings. It's huge in scope, and it often might go through generations. There's many books, and of course there's paranormal fantasy,
ghosts and the supernatural.
You'd think so, and that is true, but in practice paranormal is often vampires and werewolves and that kind of thing.
There's a lot of blurred edges between these subgenres, isn't there?
There are. The thing for an author is just to find what describes their book best.
Yeah. Steampunk is like if the 1800s history like diverted and then they just went with like magic and steam power instead of inventing electricity, right?
Yes. Yeah, it's the science.
It's like science fiction but in the 1800s.
Yeah, it's Victorian age science fiction. So if you were in...
But again, can often involve magic.
If you had some fantasy set in the modern world which wasn't actually set in an urban setting, so you couldn't call it urban fantasy, what would you call it? Contemporary fantasy.
Oh.
Then there's historical fantasy, and that's set in our world with our history, but there's a magical element put into it.
During the 1920s, but there's demons are loose in the city or something.
Yeah, no, that's
historical fantasy.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
I'd read that book. What do we have here, Johnny? It's a demon, Stephen.
So that's sort of the main categories in fantasy and sci-fi. So historical fiction doesn't have so many subgenres, but historical romance is, of course,
probably the most common one.
Yeah, that. And then there's time travel, which could also fit under science fiction. Whether you would consider your time travel book also historical fiction or science fiction or fantasy would depend where you go when you jump in your time machine and how long you spend there. Right. And then romance as a category, the subcategories of romance are just like all of those things we've already talked about.
There's a lot of books with love story element to them.
Yeah,
You know.
They're not necessarily called a romance, but there's a romantic element.
A subplot
in them. Yes.
We thought we should cover what readers will expect when you choose to label your book with these genres. So that's really the main thing, is you don't want to label your book with a genre and then have your readers be disappointed by it, because the whole point is to say, this is what you can expect when you read my book.
Yes,
right?
Yes.
So we'll go through the main points of what readers expect when they pick up a book that is labelled with a genre. So,
yes.
Thrillers.
Yes. So if you're writing a thriller, the most important thing is that there's a lot of action and a lot of tension. It has to be life and death situations, really dangerous stuff, thrilling, fast-paced, the sort of thing will keep people up at night. This is always good if you make sure that you do take a breather for some character development. Readers do appreciate a pause to take their breath. Mysteries, well, obviously.
The plot has to be solving a mystery.
That's
basically.
right. There has to be something that the protagonist has to uncover, discover, solve. Yep.
Fantasy. Magic!
Yes. In fantasy, there's got to be magic of some kind. They also expect action and adventure.
Yeah, adventure, for sure.
Yeah. But in fantasy, you've got a specific world building because you might be creating a completely imaginative world.
So for science fiction, the really important thing is that there is a basis in science.
That's right. Yes.
And it needs to make a little bit of sense on the scientific scale, because if you label a book as science fiction and the science doesn't make any sense, you're going to have some very pissed off readers who are hardcore science fiction fans.
Yes. So it's like you look into science today and the kind of experiments that people are doing and what they're working towards, and you use the basis of today's science and extrapolate.
Good word.
And you extrapolate from that. So the imagination goes, well, if that is the case, then this, and this can happen. And I think you can create like an imaginary science, that can be quite far removed from our present science, but it has to, again, have its own logic. It all has to work together such that it's believable.
Yeah.
Because even though it's a fantasy or a science fiction world, it's still got to be believable. You have to write in such a way that the reader is willing to suspend their disbelief. That's science fiction.
Historical fiction has to be historical.
Yes, and the facts have to be well researched and have to be accurate. The author will look at a particular time, they will research very carefully all the details, and then within that they will take some characters, maybe some real characters if they're dealing with famous people, or just some character that might have lived in that time, and then the imaginative part is whatever happens to that particular character.
Readers will get annoyed if you labelled it historical, and there are historical inaccuracies in there.
That's right. So with historical fiction, the most important thing is to really do your research very, very clearly so that the actual facts are the same. Yeah, and your only leeway that you can have is in the things that aren't written down.
That aren't documented.
That's right. Yes.
Yeah. Romance! There has to be a love story.
And it has to have a happy ending. That is really important. If your romance book doesn't have a happy ending, the romance reader is going to throw your book across the room and curse you. I think you just wouldn't call it a romance as its main category if it doesn't have a happy ending.
Yeah.
Also with romance, there has to be obstacles to the main characters getting together. The whole interest in the story is how they get there.
The journey of how they get together.
That's right.
Contemporary.
Yeah, contemporary fiction is obviously set in contemporary times, but it's more than that. It deals with issues that are relevant to contemporary people, the sort of challenges that contemporary people will have. It doesn't necessarily have to have a fast pace or anything like that. It tends to be more character driven than action driven. And what a reader of contemporary fiction looks for is deep characterization and an examination of themes.
Society's issues.
Yeah. Often the lines between contemporary fiction and literary fiction, they're often the same books.
So that is briefly what readers will expect from each of those genres. So what is, now that we've reached the end of the video, you promised this at the beginning, a genre that no one's heard of?
Transrealism.
What?
Transrealism. Transrealism is really rooted in reality. That's the realism part of the transrealism. And it can even be autobiographical, but it's deeply rooted in the author's experience. So it's very, very real. But alongside that is some bizarre or maybe a fantasy, science fiction or horror kind of thread that goes along with it. So it's almost like you have dual storylines in the same book, one of which is really real and the other, it's like they throw this fantasy element into the reality. The other thing about transrealism is that it doesn't have archetypal characters in it. The characters are very real. And the aim of transrealism as a sort of literary movement is to question consensual reality, to present other kind of alternative views of what reality is, and also what is considered normal in terms of character. Yeah, and like portal stuff could be transrealism, so long as it's got a good solid basis in reality. So that, for instance, you could have someone in the ordinary world and in the gaming world.
So, there you have it. We've covered a lot of different genres and subgenres and what readers will expect from each of them. Important to know when you're writing and marketing your book. It's not designed as a box that you should squeeze your book into. It's designed as a tool to tell readers what they should expect, and if you like this kind of book, then you will like my book. If you like this video and found it entertaining, please like it, share it, and subscribe!
Yes, and this is just part of a series that we're doing on novel writing, and we're taking you from the very beginning right through to publication. So do subscribe just to make sure that you don't miss the rest of the series. Catch you next time.
Bye!
Bye!